Good morning, everyone. We can start the class now. We are going to continue our discussion, Is God a Vindictive Bully? This is technically week 5, but calendar speaking, it's week 6, because we had that little break last week, which I'm not complaining about. I've been sick for like 2 weeks, so that was a very nice break. But I'm going to continue with this, starting the class off with a little bit of a fun fact because, I don't know, helps me start the things. So I'm going to talk about the Council of Nicaea, which has become like the boogeyman for atheists. It's this weird thing where there's a lot of myths around it, and if you ask your normal atheist, they will probably say something like the canon of the Bible was picked out at the Council of Nicaea, and it's picked out by Constantine and all these bishops, which is this really silly idea because it was not picked out there. The canon was actually already established way before that. What they're actually doing here is they were fighting against the Marcion heresy, where there was this guy, his name was Marcion, and he said Jesus was created. And so they got this council together. There's like, I don't know, 120 people, and like 3 of them agreed with Marcion, and the rest were like, you're a heretic. So that's what actually happened there. But this kind of popular idea that the canon of the Bible was established was created by this abomination of a book, the Da Vinci Code. And if you, with many other historical inaccuracies inside of it, but they claim Dan Brown, the guy who wrote this book, uses this historical thing about how in the Council of Nicaea, they set the books on the table and then they left the room, and when they came back, the books that were in the Bible were sitting on top of the table, and the ones that were considered heretical were put under the table, and that's how the canon of the Bible was discovered. Of course, that's completely made up, but if you've ever wondered where it came from this guy, Voltaire, kind of this horrible guy in the Enlightenment. We'll probably talk about him later because he has a lot of terrible opinions. You could also talk to Brian about it. He has a lot of fun opinions about Voltaire also. But this guy who says he really was against Christianity because it was the great skepticism, created one of the greatest atheist skepticisms of the time, which I find so funny. But yeah, he's the one who wrote the whole thing. He basically heard some hearsay of someone saying this, and then he just took it, the whole way, and just like, yeah, this is totally true. No historical analysis, no nothing like that. Just like, yeah, totally. So that's where we get this silly idea that the Council of Nicaea created the canon, even though it did not. So that's the fun fact for the day. So we are going to continue our discussion. So I'm actually trying to make today a little bit of a remedial lesson, because we had lots of great discussion last time, but I think I didn't hit all the points perfectly, so I think I'm going to quickly go over some of them, and some of them we're going to go deeper into study them more. So last week, 2 weeks ago, that was actually 2 weeks ago, we talked about this verse, when you wage war against your enemies and there's a woman that you'd like to marry, you have to do these things. There's lots of discussion about she must shave her hair, cut her nails, and remove her prisoner's clothing, right? That's very foreign to us, and I think it's probably because we live in such a globalist monoculture that this seems very foreign to us. And what I mean by that is, like, say you'll go really kind of anywhere in the world, generally speaking, people would wear and look like they'll wear the same clothes as you and look kind of similar in that sense, and that's because we've kind of taken the English culture and just kind of taken a paintbrush and painted the whole world with it, right? I mean, look at the UN, and everyone is wearing suits and ties, and I'm like, I think we can safely say that, or NATO, like, all the nations gather, and you're like, I think most of these people aren't Edwardian gentlemen. But back in the day, clothing was very important and all sorts of stuff, and it was a way to basically show your allegiance to idols and whatnot. So we're going to look at one culture in particular, and that culture being Egypt. So in Egypt, colors of your color, like the color of your clothes, meant actually depended upon was like, your worship of your god, right? So like if you had a particular god you were for, you had that color in your clothing or in your jewelry and stuff like that. So clothing was an idea of like how you would basically worship your god. And it's why often when you see people in Egypt, especially depicted in hieroglyphs, like this woman on the side, they're wearing white clothing, it's because that's pure, right? That's part of their thing. They wanted to be ritualistically pure, and so they would always wear white to kind of show that, yes, I'm a pure person. So clothing was very important to that. So, that's idolatry. Also, hair was very important to the Egyptians. They would actually shave their hair and have these wigs on because they wanted to be like, I'm going to butcher this name. Okay. Hathor. I think that's how you say her. She's basically the mother of a lot of the gods. That's her in the corner there. And her hair is describing to be long, beautiful hair with thick black locks. And so you see this in a lot of depictions of Egypt's, in their hieroglyphs and stuff like that. And in modern days, whenever they depict them, they always depict them like this, because that was the standard they were going for. And it was even something even like lower class people would do. Maybe not to the same extent as the upper class and whatnot, but they would try to make their hair like Hathor's. And so as you can see this, where you have these pipers who would be semi-lower class people because they would be just musicians who played for nobles and whatnot. They made their hair like that. So again, leading to more religion. Where'd the picture go for this one? I had this picture for this, but I don't know where it went. It was a hieroglyph of a woman looking at her nails. Actually, for this one, you guys are blessed because I found this really cool picture of a mummy's hand that still had nail polish on it with actual depictions of cultic Egyptian symbols. But I decided against it because I thought most people would not find that as cool as I would. So I cut that from there. I had this picture of a Egyptian woman looking at her nails, like a hieroglyph of her actually looking at nail extensions, but I have no idea where that went. So we'll just deal with nothing right now. So, but nails were very important to them. Also, they would, draw little depictions of their icons and whatnot on their nails, and we have even mummies to this day where that nail polish has actually survived, which I think is kind of cool. But yeah, so as you can see at the time, all of these things were very much very important, and that's why God says you need to strip off all that idolatry before you can make this person basically try to bring them into the fold of God. So that's why they would do that. Good? Everyone? Okay. Well, if you have some time this Christmas season and you want to go a little bit further, you can always watch this movie. So... AI, good for silly little stupid jokes. So, jokes aside, another thing we kind of talked about was basically prohibition versus regulation, right? There was a question about how do you deal... Okay, there we go. How do you deal with this where you say you shall not intermarry, and then you have later in Deuteronomy where it continues to talk about regulations for how to deal with marrying a foreign woman, right? And so how we have to do about that is I would like to first talk about divorce, because fun fact, this happens many times in the Bible. It happens many times in the Old Testament where you have basically God prohibit something, and then there's a regulation to how to deal with it, right? And so you actually have to turn to the New Testament where you have Christ, and he will actually, he taught the Pharisees or asked him this question is like, if man was made to be married in a lifelong covenant, why did Moses allow us to get divorce? And Christ, of course, says, because of your hardness of hearts, right? And so that happens a lot in the Old Testament where you have something you're going through and you're like, okay, it says do not marry foreign women. And then you turn a few pages later and then there's another, like you have a regulation for dealing with foreign women. And it's because God knew that people would sin and then they would do stuff. And it's kind of a way to regulate that exchange. So if you read further in that verse, you would see that the reason that they become a full wife is so that you can't just send her away, humiliating her. So he's trying to prevent this, this lustful passion that the person had. They had to go through. It was like, okay, if you're going to do this, you have to treat it as, this person is a full wife. So, good? Yes?
So we're talking in the Old Testament about not marrying or marrying in different tribes and stuff, different faiths that they had. In the New Testament, don't we just say do not be unequally yoked?
Yes. So the New Testament, there is stronger regulations and there is not but there is still things where it talks about, like, if you think about it, there are verses that talk about if you're married to an unsaved person, right? It's kind of a similar vein there. While you have that, you have that prohibition, there are still people who go out and, I would say sinfully. I mean, there's three ways you can get into that situation. You're both saved, or you're saved, and your spouse says they're a Christian, and then they walk away. You're both not saved, and you become saved, or you are saved, and you choose to go out and marry that way, even though you go against what Scripture says, right? So yes, you still kind of have that in the New Testament. So, Mr. Tompkins.
We saw, unfortunately, through the life of Solomon, of marrying many foreign women, that they turned his heart away from Jehovah.
Yeah. Yeah. They did, and it did a lot of damage, and that's why it says you shouldn't, but then there's ways, and then you see when there are regulations, there are the whole things about kind of stripping back that idolatry to prevent that from happening. So, yes. Good? Okay, so now we're going to talk about the fun part. So, when I created this class, I kind of had these extra lessons where I didn't know how to throw in there. But I have actually a few more of these. So if you have any questions about something that you think is hard to deal with, let me know, and I probably have a lesson on it. And I was kind of hoping to shoehorn them in eventually. But we had really great discussion about, a certain verse where we said it could be referring to rape. And we had some discussion about rape that time. So I had this lesson about rape because there's actually a lot of misunderstanding on it, and there's actually a lot of atheists who make claims about how the Bible does not, or how the Bible protects rapists and doesn't actually help them, or doesn't help the victims involved, right? So I kind of wanted to go through this, and so that's what we are going to talk about. So if I could get you all to turn to Deuteronomy 22. So we're going to be doing 3 verses in succession that all talk about rape, and we're going to go through them. It doesn't all talk about rape. It actually talks about different aspects, and we're going to talk about it and hopefully get what I would hope a clearer and full understanding of this. So if someone would be willing to read Deuteronomy 22, verses 23 and 24.
If a man takes a wife and goes into her and then hates her and accuses her of misconduct and brings a bad name upon her, saying,
Are you reading 23 and 24?
well, I said 13, I can't see good.
Okay. Bethany, you offered to read 23 and 24 if you could.
If there is a betrothed virgin and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman because she did not cry for help, though she was in the city, and the man because he violated his neighbor's wife. So you shall purge the evil from your midst.
Okay. fun stuff. So the first one is, so you'll see this in case law where they kind of take things one after the other. So you are in a city and a man sleeps with a woman and she doesn't cry out. That's why that comes way later, right here. Comes later in the thing. If that does not happen, then you're supposed to take both of them and execute them. So a lot of people get this wrong when they're kind of reading through it because they think of it first as rape, but that's not what's happening. What's happening here is that two people are committing adultery, right? They are caught in the act, and then the woman says, oh, I was raped, this was unconsensual, basically, in that sense. And then they'll say, well, you were not screaming out, because in those cities back then, when you had these types of things, they didn't really have, walls and glass windows and stuff like we have today. They were very closely packed. You would have heard this. It's basically to prevent that, where she's basically trying to wheedle out of her execution because of that sentence. So that's what this first one's talking about. But now we are going to go, the next two verses are about now we're actually talking about rape. So if I could get someone to read 25 and 27, if someone would like to do that. Actually, hold on. I guess I should ask, does anyone have any questions about that first verse before I just blaze past that? No? Okay, cool. So now, 25, 27. Anyone interested in reading? Connor, thank you.
But if in the field the man finds the girl who's engaged, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lies with her shall die. Did you say just 25 or 25 and 26?
25, 26, and I believe 27.
Beautiful. But you shall do nothing to the girl. There is no sin in the girl worthy of death. For just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is this case. When he found her in the field, the engaged girl cried out, but there was no one to save her.
Okay. So, now we're dealing with this situation. So, a few things I find very interesting in this case is, so now you're dealing with, basically, they're out in the country, no one's around to deal with them. What I find very interesting is that, where it says the do nothing to the woman, is it assumes her innocence, right? There is no investigation into this thing. It's like, okay, you found, you have this situation. What it does is it assumes the woman's innocence, in the sense of how, there's no sin in her, right? Even though they find her, or they found this, because there was no one to hear. If she cried out, there's no one to verify that claim, because you're in the wilderness, there's no way you can verify that claim. So in the previous one, we dealt with it. So if we take the previous one and she cried out, then this is how you would work out with it, is okay, so she cried out, so we just execute the man because the woman is innocent. So I find that really interesting, that they deal with, so in that case where there's no one to verify that, the woman is always seen as innocent. The second thing I find really interesting is this right here. This case is like that of someone who attacked and murdered their neighbor. So what it is saying there is that rape is equivalent to murdering her, right? That's what this verse is saying. It says if you rape a woman, that is the equivalent, that is equivalent to murdering this woman, right? So, which I find really interesting. A lot of times in the Old Testament, or a lot of times these historians say the Bible stole from Hammurabi's code, right? Because technically it was earlier, which I find really interesting, because guess what Hammurabi's code says about rape? Exactly, absolutely nothing. So, I find that really interesting in this case, that one, it goes so far. I mean, this is, even to this day, there are places that don't treat rape equivalent. Even, in America's past, it wasn't even treated equivalent in that sense. But I find that really interesting. So it's talking here, and that's why this is often translated as rape. And we'll get into this translation here, because the next verse we get a little, unfortunately, gummy in trying to figure stuff out. So, before we move on, any questions, ideas? Anyone want to make a comment? Cool. Oh, yes, Mr. Tompkins.
Why do you think that culture equivalent rape
because it is equivalent with murder.
Okay.
Right? You are basically depriving this woman of, I mean, I would say even more in that culture, it's even closer to murder because you've basically taken a woman, and so like a woman who and culturally speaking, the woman would be, have a harder time finding a husband, if even impossible, right? And back then, women would really struggle. So, like, if you read about not Esther, Ruth, and no, I can't. My brain is a little wacky today. But you hear about widows who, like, God gave gave like, protections for widows and people like that. Right, and that was to protect them. But that's what would happen if a woman was raped. So you are basically destroying her entire life. And even to this day, I mean, the sad reality is, like, if this happens to a woman, it's absolutely destructive. I think it's equivalent, if not worse, than that sense. But, that just from stuff like that. Yes, Marcia.
I think also if the woman doesn't get married because she's been violated, then she won't have children.
Yeah.
And in that culture, she's doomed to poverty.
Oh, yeah. No, it's terrible. Even in today, I saw Mr. Foster, then Bethany.
Taking nothing away from just everything you said, it's also possible that the case is the woman was completely innocent, just like the person who was murdered.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, yeah.
you might be just establishing that, but it probably goes beyond that, like you said, too. So.
Yes, if of course that is the other thing is, like, if the woman was actually raped. In the previous one, if she screamed out for help, she would be innocent in that case. She's innocent in this case. It's just that if no one is there to hear them, then you could theoretically have someone who isn't innocent, right? They were committing adultery. But at that case, since you can't, divine which one is correct, you always assume the woman is innocent. So Bethany, you had a
What I
question?
was gonna say is it was just showing the woman's innocence and the man's guilt.
Yes. Yeah. So, well, and in the previous one, if she screamed out, right, she would have been innocent, right? So it's basically if there are people around who can help the woman, right, she's innocent in that case also, right? So that's what it's talking about here. So this is case law where they kind of lay out different things. How do you deal with each situation? And so that's what it's talking about here is when you deal with this situation, you treat it equivalently like murder, right? Good? Any other questions? Yes.
I mean, it's pointing out specifically that she's engaged to be married, so it's also
Yes.
following the sanctity of the marriage to be. It's ruining that for the man, ruining that for the woman, and just a whole lot comes along with that can't be recovered from.
So there is a lot of discussion about the engagement, and you could also say this is married, right? Like, the betrothed could also technically mean it's married, like in that sense. It's not just if you engage. And that leads us into a great question, because we're going to have to talk about that, because the next verses where we get a little gum in the wheels. So, would anyone like to read 28 and 29? Mr. Tompkins, awesome.
If a man finds a girl who is a virgin, who is not engaged, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are discovered, then the man who lies with her shall give to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall become his wife because he has violated her. He cannot divorce her all his days.
Okay, so this is where we get into a little bit of, there's a lot of discussion on this. So I'm going to try to boil it down in I'll try to boil it down as best I can. So, so NIV actually translates this as rape. But there is actually, the discussion is this the same as in the previous verse, as we saw here where it's talking about rape? So, there is a lot of discussion, and there's two options. You have option one, which this is rape, and option two, this is not. So, the people who say option one, that this is not rape, their reasoning is they use if she was discovered, she's not rescued, right? That's what it talks about in previous times. So it's talking about if they're discovered, it's more in that sense of it's used previously as if they're found out like in adultery. And then they use the argument that the next few things are talking about consensual sex. And if you look, they're talking about, I think it's like sleeping with your stepmother and things like that. The words used in verse 25 and 28 are different. This is kind of their biggest claim of why they say it's not. And then, of course, in the previous thing, they've already, the verse already equivocated that rape is equivalent to murder. That is not if you look at this sense, I won't flew by it. This right here, it's you treat it as someone who's attacked and murders a neighbor. This is technically not in regards to just this case, right? This is in regards to any form of rape, right? So that's the legal code there. And generally, I don't like to do a consensus, but this has been the consensus of scholars, of theologians, both rabbis and Christian scholars for a long time. I don't care about academic scholars because they're kind of worthless. Mr. Foster.
Another thought is, after this happened, we would have the option of telling somebody, and it didn't happen.
True.
So it seems more consensual.
Yes. It's a little bit hard, and this is actually where I talked about where people, I think, can get a little struggle, is if you, I've actually talked to atheists who says, where they say things like, you rape a woman, you get a wife, right? That was a saying actually in 2008, you saw a lot online. But I'm going to try, I lean towards the first option, but I'll give an explanation. So I think the best option, or the best evidence of this is it actually uses a completely different word. Also, did you know Strong's is actually in NASB now? I just found that out. So I'm sorry that this is in KJV because I thought it was, I thought that's the only thing Strong's is in. So in the Hebrew, the word, not for the word that lies for, that's what this one is. So that's, I had this pointed out. So this one, that's the lies with. That's not the same as the modifier. So if you notice the 709, and then...
It is the same.
Yeah, this one's the same, but the modifier's different, right? So that's what you're looking for. So the lies with word. So this one right here, the 709, if you look at that, that is just lies with, right? So you have to look at the modifier. So yes, this is the same, but you have to look at the modifying words that deal with it. So you have 7238, that's the C's there, and then the 8610, which is that one. The C's is there. They both say C's, but they're different words, right? So C's and lies with. That's what we're looking at. So that's what this word is. It just means lie with. So then the first one is, this is the rape one, right? This is what we translate as rape. So this is the modifying word for that. You have to strengthen, prevail, harden, be strong, overpower. That's what this word is saying. So this is what we translate as rape in the first verse, right? And so that's, overpower, it's basically saying overpowering sleeping with someone, right? So that's what they translate as rape. In the second one, it's to basically to catch, to handle, lay hold, take hold of, seize, wield, right? It's used more in a sense of, this is the word that is often used to deal with playing an instrument. Right, it's more like that. That's the word that's used for. So there's one other time that this word is used for what I call inappropriate but consensual sex. It's the adultery test, which is in Numbers, basically. It's the same one there, 8610, right? Let's go back, 8610. 8610, right? Where it's talking about a woman who is having is committing adultery with another man, and then her husband accuses her, but it talks about it in that sense there. Other ways that it is used, I have no idea who this guy is, but he compiled this whole long list of every time that this word is used, which I thought was really interesting. So, again, it's often used for handling. You can even use it to, taking God's name, not in vain, but using it appropriately. And so if you take this position, then there is actually a partner verse with that, and that is actually Exodus 22. And this is where often people go with this, where they say, okay, if it's rape, you kill the man because he is, committed a sin, and the woman, you don't. But the partner verse with this in Exodus 22 is, if a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleep with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, then he must still pay the bride price for virgins. So what this is saying, if you take the verses to not be rape, which is general consensus, that is what people do. This is kind of the companion verse that goes with it, where it's basically they had consensual sex, but she wasn't married, right? And so then they are wed, because then that just basically keeps this man from running away and being, a deadbeat husband, right? But yeah. Good on that fact. I know I just went into the Hebrew and whatnot to kind of prove my point. Yes, Dad.
Is that perhaps why young girls were betrothed at early ages to protect them from that?
No, I mean, they were often betrothed at young ages because that was just kind of the norm, right? They lived a lot shorter lives, so they didn't go off to college, they didn't go do these things, so they didn't even have high school back then, right? So often you would get betrothed really early on, sometimes in 13 to 15 years old, because they would, that was just the norm, right? Because, you didn't live as long, you didn't have as much to do, right? But yeah, yes?
So is this the Old Testament's version of a shotgun wedding?
Yes, it probably would be the Old Testament version of a shotgun wedding. Yes, that would, there's Cantrell.
I find it interesting that we've spent a lot of time on this, and for me, it just dawned on me that there would have been a lot of speculation about marrying.
There would have been, yeah.
In this exact vein.
Yeah. That is very true, and there probably was. If you believe in church tradition, then there was, but that's often kind of a mess and a half. So if there's not, are we good? Because now I'm going to talk about option 2, and this is basically pointing to the fact that it's a progression legal code, right? You see this with other things where they take different cases. So the first one, she's married, right? Or betrothed, and this happens. Then that's where the illegal argument goes. This happens, and the other times where you have legal cases with it. And some people, it's the lesser interpretation of it. But someone you might know who takes this interpretation is actually Wiersbe. I found that out when I was looking at his commentary, but he takes this interpretation. So, yes, this is, of course, in our modern times, this is not great. I think it's, we really struggle with this, and I think we could all agree that marrying a rape victim to a rapist would be really bad, right? But there are ways that you need to look at it. Is this woman was now basically not protected, right? And then she basically would have protections because the community would come around. And there's actually, so 2 situations where I found this. There's this rabbi who took this interpretation. He had a victim who was married to a rapist, and their sins, and he came around at least once a week and checked on them and basically kept the husband in line. It was like, hey, you have to do this. And like he would do this, basically he would keep that man in line because he thought that was his responsibility, right? Another one, which I find really funny, is in the medieval ages. I found this case where a woman was raped by a man. They married them, and once it was officially legalized, they executed the man. So I thought that was really funny, and then she inherited everything that he owned. So that's always, I think, I find that really funny. But again, generally speaking, people have always typically interpreted it as the equivalent to this Exodus verse here. So, good? Okay. I don't know, it's not very fun talking about rape. Okay. So, now we are going to go back to where we were that one time. We're talking about this Leviticus verse where I said it can be ambiguous here, right? Where is that? Okay, this right here. Where I said this sleeps with right here can be ambiguous. So if we look at the Strong's word for this, you can see here it's the act of lying, laying, or coaxing, right? Coding. And then, of course, the act of lying sexually. And there are other times where this is used, but unfortunately, like in a sexual sense, but they are often broad brush things, like if you do this, then you are unclean for a certain amount of time. Things like that. Basically, like you see here, he's basically a man, is then unclean for a portion. It's cleanliness laws, not necessarily used. So this is still ambiguous. I would say, in my opinion, I lean towards the consensual side. Again, because you do, as some people pointed out, you do have the punishment is for both of them, not just for one. They do talk about it just with the man individually, which is a way to say that, but also this Exodus passage where this is consensual sex is also just everything's put on the man there, right? So, I don't know. So, in my opinion, I think this verse that we kind of struggled with 2 weeks ago, I would say this is consensual, but could be either way, and then you have to do the interpretive work of how you would take that other ways. Any questions? Comments? Or shall we move on? Because this has been such a fun topic. Okay. Cool. Okay, now we are going to move on back to hopefully finishing slavery. Why is this shifted weirdly? I have no idea. Okay. So we got like 6 minutes left. So I am going to skip this Leviticus passage and go, okay, I don't know what happened here. Okay, I want to go straight to the New Testament because we don't really have that much time left. We have like 6 minutes, so I'm going to pull that back. And can I have someone turn to Ephesians 6, 5 through 9? And if they would be willing to read, that would be fantastic. So we're going to quickly talk about the New Testament. So I find the New Testament to be very interesting because I think it's oft abused in both directions. You had a lot of the Southern slaveholders where they would only quote half verses. You know, you have the slaves obey your masters, but then you have like, the verses where it talks about masters treating your slaves just like yourself, right? And so I find it's oft abused where you have that, but then you have the other way where now we have these museums and they say, they would quote these Bible passages and the Bible taught a brutal, oppressive slavery. And I'm like, no, it did not. So I always find it interesting that it's kind of both ways. But do I have a reader? Brent, thank you.
Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the integrity of your heart as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, serving with good will as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him.
Yeah, they like to cut out this last bit right here. I always find that so funny, where they, where you have basically this thing where it says, treat your slaves in the same way, right? That was, of course, completely foreign to the people at the time. I mean, if you look at Roman slavery, you could do whatever you wanted to your slaves and no one cared. It was similar to how it was in the South, except they tried to put like a veneer of religiosity over it. Another one that is kind of in the same vein is Colossians 3, 22 through 24. I don't know where this one came from. I'll just read this one. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eyes are on you and to curry their favor, but sincerely of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whenever you work at all with your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that they will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. And the Lord Christ you are serving, anyone who does wrong will be repaid for the wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you are also have a master in heaven, right? So I know these often were abused at the time, but always find it so interesting. You just go like a verse or two later, and it completely invalidates everything that I think what happened in the South, right? Good? Okay. Any questions, comments? Any other topic? Yes, Dad.
I once had a Christian employee, I was a supervisor,
Yes.
who told me that he was not a slave.
Oh, yeah, this also applies to if you're working. Yeah.
Okay, why is that true?
Okay, so this is a general sense, right? So yes, it is pointing to slaves right here, but at the time, slaves could be both a wage worker and also someone you personally owned, right? So we get kind of weird, like, when we hear the word slave, but at the Roman time, you had two classes. You had aristocrats who never sold their labor for work, right, or for money. And then you had people who sold their labor for money in lots of different forms. They were all called slaves, right? So in the sense of, if you take it into the modern day, if you work for an employer, you are selling your labor for money, right? And that is the equivalent to slave, right? In the Roman sense, right? And so that's what this verse is pointing to. So yes, if you this also applies to your work, right? Don't, do a half job, work the best as if you're working for the Lord, right? That's also, this applies to us today. So, fun fact. So your employee, even though he said he was not a slave, in the Roman sense, he is. And we're all slaves to our bosses, right? Because that's what this meant, right? Yes, Marcia.
Slaves didn't get paid, did they?
Some did. So it depended on the slave. So again, what I was saying earlier is slaves were a broad sense, right? So there were some slaves that you owned that you didn't pay, right? They were typically your war captives who had no marketable skills. But you would also have Greek slaves who you would pay because they would teach your children Greek and Latin and all that fun stuff. And you'd pay them because they were way more valuable and you wanted to make sure that they did a good job. And part of the way you would entice them to do a good job is if you gave them money, right? So you would still, if you personally owned them, you would still feed them, house them, shelter them, blah, 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 all that stuff. But then you'd give them money on top of them because you have a vested interest in your children, having a good learning experience, right? But the whole slave sense was they thought anyone, they equated anyone who worked for money to be a slave, right? Because what that meant is while you were working, you basically had to do whatever the boss said, right? Whoever was paying you, you had to do what they said as if you were a slave, right?
But you don't have a retirement program.
I don't think Rome had retirement programs.
You can't quit and go to somebody else.
Yeah, most people back then just died on the job. So, yeah, retirement's not in the Bible. Sorry to say. But any other questions, comments, any other topic you want me to try to tackle? If not, we are free to go. Cool. That was fun.
So you got a haircut.